Hello, and welcome to the Christian Habits Podcast. This is the podcast that will help you break free from your strongholds, draw closer to God, and develop habits that will help you love God and others better. And now, here's your host, Barb Raveling.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. It's so good to have all of you here today. And I am excited to have Sarah Hauser today. Sarah is a writer and speaker living in the Chicago suburbs with her husband and 4 kids. And she shares biblical truth to nourish the soul and the occasional recipe to nourish the body. And today we're going to be talking about Sarah's book, All Who Are Weary, Finding True Rest by Letting Go of the Burdens You Were Never Meant to Carry. I love that subtitle. Welcome to the podcast, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's good to have you here. Why don't you start out by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So as you said, I've got 4 kids and a loud rescue dog who hopefully will stay quiet during this interview. But my husband and I and our family, we live in the Chicago suburbs. I'm actually originally from New Jersey, and so came out to the Midwest for school and landed here ever since. I write and speak and just love sharing things that God is teaching me. So everything I write and speak about, I feel like is things that God has been convicting me of. And so I just love being able to share about that.
Yeah, that's good. And I like to, in your book, you write about things that you've been through too. And I think that's super helpful. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book? Why this particular book?
Yeah. So back in about 2018, 2019, I was walking through a pretty dark season of depression. And along with that, and before that a little bit, came a season of postpartum anxiety and depression as well. And was really wrestling through a lot of things that I knew in my head, these truths about God and about myself. I'd grown up in the church. I had a strong faith background. But during that season, I was really wrestling with, what do I actually believe God loves me? Do I actually believe these things that I've been learning, for 30 years? And God really taught me a lot during that season. And I ended up having quite a bit of counseling. And through that counseling, one of the things I had to do for homework was to write down lies that I was believing, all the lies that I was believing just about who I am, about my life, about God, and then write down truth that kind of combats those lies. And so at the time, I was not thinking that would turn into a book. I was, having trouble getting out of bed for a season, so writing a book was not on my radar. But as the Lord brought me out of that season of darkness, I started to see and to write a little bit more about that experience and about some of the things that God had been teaching me, and seemed to resonate with people. And so that list of lies versus truth actually ended up kind of becoming a skeleton outline of what this book is. So those lies being these burdens that we carry, these beliefs that we have about who God is and who we are and the work that He's called us to do. And so over the course of years, that was many, many years, were a long process, that ended up kind of becoming this book.
That's interesting. And, when you say that the lies became the skeletal of the book, if you look at the book, the table of contents, Sarah has a lot of interesting topics in each of those areas. And I'm guessing maybe those go along with the lies. She has condemnation, worry, self-sufficiency, insecurity, comparison, perfectionism, insignificance, despair. Do all those go along with the lies you were believing?
They do. Yeah. So condemnation, just believing, am I really forgiven? Is it really true what God says, that there's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ? And, I struggled with worthlessness. That's a chapter in the book, and really wrestling with, this lie that I have believed about everybody would be better off without me. And does God really love me? And, just all of those things are tied up in lies that I believed and wrestled through. And, I knew the Sunday school answers. I knew, but I had to really reckon with it sort of in my gut a little bit more deeply.
Yeah, I find that's true too. Like when I go through a trial, it seems like it boils down to, am I really going to believe everything in the Bible? Because if I really believe everything in the Bible, things are going to go a different way here.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, one of the chapters you talk about is perfectionism. I wanted to talk a little bit about that because that's not anything we've talked about too often on the podcast. And I'd just like to know a little bit more about your struggle with that and, how you're finding freedom in that. So could you tell me a little bit about perfectionism, what it is and how it impacts us?
Yeah. So, for me, I think, at least for me, and maybe for many of us, we have one very particular idea of perfectionism. My house has to look perfect, or my, a meal has to turn out perfect, or my whatever it is, that can kind of be maybe the typical way we think of perfectionism. But what I have sort of learned is that I struggle with perfectionism on a much deeper level than that. I used to struggle with perfectionism more, in my home and things like that. And then I had 4 kids and the dog. And, the Lord stripped me of that perfectionism because my house is sort of always a mess and just kind of having to learn to let some things go. And I thought I had kind of kicked perfectionism out. I thought I had kind of gotten over that tendency. And I learned that, you know what? No, I still really struggle with this. I still struggle with wanting things in my life and plans in my life to go a particular way and to work out in sort of some kind of ideal. And then when they don't, I am not happy about it, and I think, perfectionism is different than this like striving for excellence. It's like an unhealthy fixation on a perfect state of being or a set of circumstances in order for things to be what you want them to be, right? So perfectionists try to live up to often impossible ideals. When we struggle with perfectionism, we can struggle to give ourselves or others grace. We berate ourselves when we fall short or when we fail. There's not a lot of grace there, or that pursuit can lead to burnout and overwork. And like I've seen in my own life, that can lead to even anger. When we have these ideals about what we want, whatever it is in our life to look like, it could be, our vacation plans, or it could be our house, or it could be, the way that our family looks. When those things go wrong, I think that can reveal some of the deeper perfectionism in our hearts.
Okay. Why do you think we go the route of perfectionism? Because not everybody goes that route. So why do some of us go the perfectionist route, or why do we go to the perfectionist route in some areas of our lives and not in others?
I think it's about control. I think we want control over our circumstances. And one of the things I talk about in the book is sort of the antidote to perfectionism is surrender, and learning to let go of that control, and learning to trust and acknowledge that God is the one in control, and that my role is to do the things that He has called me to do, and to love God and love my neighbor, and that whole process looks very messy. And I think at least for me, it's a lot of times I want that control. I want to know what's going to happen, or I want to be able to predict how things are going to work out in the end. And so I have this ideal, and I want things to work out that way.
Yeah, I think sometimes the anxiety is what leads to our, like some people, maybe they're wanting the perfect house, but maybe for other people, it's anxiety about some situation that triggers the perfectionism, because it's like we're trying to control that situation. Yeah. So that thing that we fear is going to happen won't happen. Do you think that happens sometimes with perfectionism?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think too, I mean, going back to even with just what you said about, even things like wanting to have the perfect house, I think along with that control, a piece of that is wanting to control what others think of us, and built into that is insecurity, which I talk about in a whole nother chapter, but it's so interrelated, because I think sometimes we want to control our image. We can be perfectionists about how people view us. And it's not sometimes that we want people to view us as perfect, we know we're not perfect, but we want to sort of curate our image in front of people. And so when that goes awry, I'll give you an example. One time when one of my kids was about 3 years old, he or she, I won't name names, but just had an epic meltdown in the library. And it was in like the upstairs which was like the grown-up section of the library. And so it wasn't even like the downstairs kids area, which is always a little louder. I mean, she just had a full-on meltdown. And I got so angry and so upset. And I realized after the fact, I mean, I had to deal with, her misbehavior. It was like a behavior issue in that particular instance. But I was so angry, and I sort of realized a lot of my anger really had to do with how I thought others were viewing me. It had nothing to do with me being angry at her behavior. It was really my insecurity and my desire to appear a certain way and to have, some kind of persona that really caused a lot of that anger. And I think that can be a part of perfectionism as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think sometimes perfectionism comes out in areas you wouldn't expect it. Because I don't care if my house is perfect. I don't really think I ever cared if my kids were perfect. But I'm a perfectionist when it comes to decisions because I want like a super fun life. And so I want the best life possible. So when it comes to a decision, like right now, we're kind of deciding, we're selling our house. What do we do next? It's like, I want to have the perfect decisions. I won't regret.
Yes.
Like I won't regret leaving a town that is really kind of perfect, which we're thinking of leaving. And so have you ever run into that type of perfection? Because that seems like kind of an odd sort of perfectionism, but I feel like that's the one I have.
I absolutely can relate to that. I think that's for me, that comes back to this desire for control, or sometimes maybe control has a little bit too much of a negative connotation, but certainty. It's like I want that certainty in my life, and I can completely relate to that idea of wanting to not make a wrong move and not make a wrong decision. My husband and I are making some decisions for our family here as well, and I feel like we've even wrestled with that, and just having to kind of open our hands and say, okay, Lord, you're not trying to trick us, and, you're not trying to, push us one way or the other necessarily. If we're talking about two good options, we're not talking about an immoral option and something else, but learning to open our hands and say, okay, Lord, whatever you have, we'll do. And offering that surrender instead of that sort of tight grip on how I want things to be has been really something that I'm wrestling through.
Yeah. And I really like one of the quotes in the book. Letting go of perfectionism means grieving what we wish life was and soaking up grace for what life is. So of course, in that quote, you're talking about some life that that's already feeling imperfect. And I don't know, could you tell us a little bit more about what you meant by that and how that affects your current life that's not living up to expectations, and maybe also your fears about a future life that might not live up to expectations?
Yeah. So I want to make sure to give credit to where that quote kind of came from. Was actually my cousin and my cousin's wife have really been going through a challenging, it's maybe been about 10 years now, a challenging season. My cousin was diagnosed with MS, and he's got progressive MS, and it's been really, really hard. There's a lot of medical challenges. My cousin's wife, Stacy, I actually got a quote from her in the book where she talks about this idea of surrendering and learning to grieve what we wish life was and soak up grace for what life is. And she has been a huge example to me of that surrender, because you don't expect your, healthy 30-something at the time husband to come down with progressive MS. That's not something that any of us expect or want, but that's what happened to them, and learning how to let go and say, okay, Lord, this is, we grieve what this is, and we grieve what this has done to our family, but we're going to soak up grace for what life is. And I think when we hold on to perfectionism, that's when bitterness and resentment can grow. And that's when I think that can often cause us to run from God at times. But when we're able to open our hands and let go of that perfectionistic ideal of what life looks like, then we're able to soak up the grace that God has for us in whatever season He is bringing us through.
Yeah, I remember talking to a young woman once, and she was grieving something, and she said what she recognized she had to do to let go was to grieve the loss of a dream, the loss of how she was expecting her life to turn out. It didn't turn out that way. So she had to give that up the dream, and recognize that no, she's not living that life. So you have to figure out how you're going to make the best life in the context of what you can't change.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's hard because, the Lord allows suffering for whatever reason, but there's a lot to learn in the midst of those circumstances.
Yeah. And really, when I think back in my life of the times that were really, really hard, a lot of those times were the times I felt the closest to God. I do think in some ways you can be close to God anytime, but there's a certain level of closeness that maybe you can't reach if you're not, in a really hard suffering. In fact, was that in your book that you brought up that Corrie ten Boom quote? Tell us about that, because I think that's probably what made me think about it was your book that I was reading.
Yeah. So this was just a beautiful picture of, I think, what suffering can do. And I talk about this in the introduction to my book, but Corrie ten Boom, who was a Dutch Christian who hid Jews in her home with her family during World War II, she was arrested and eventually brought to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. And in her book, The Hiding Place, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend everybody to read that. But she wrote this, and I want to read from her because I want to get the quote right. But she said, "Life in Ravensbrück took place on two separate levels, mutually impossible. One, the observable external life, grew every day more horrible. The other, the life we lived with God, grew daily better, truth upon truth, glory upon glory." And I just feel like to be able to listen to somebody or to read the words of somebody who has lived through the Holocaust, who says, hey, our outward life got harder, but our inner life got better. That's unbelievable to me, and I think, that's what Paul talks about, where our inner lives are being renewed day by day in 2 Corinthians 4. And that's something that I want, right? And I think that's one of the real themes of my book too, is that this idea that this deep soul rest doesn't depend on our circumstances, but it depends on our God. And I think the comfort of that is just knowing that then we can have that rest no matter what our circumstances are. And I've seen that, in reading stories like Corrie ten Boom's and, in my cousin's life and in others who are grieving and who have gone through really hard things, but are still able to rest in who God is ultimately.
Yeah, I've seen that in my own life too, how God can give you peace and joy in the midst of a really hard trial. But you said that in your book. I've experienced it, but a lot of people say, no, that's not true. There's no way you can. Life is too hard. There's always going to be stress. You can't experience that if life is really hard. So what would you say to the person who says that, who's listening like, nah, that's not true?
I would almost say, test God on that. Like Jesus invites us to say, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. I was just reading a sermon from Charles Spurgeon about that particular passage of scripture, which is sort of the foundation of my book. And that's kind of what he says is, don't take Jesus' promises lightly. Christ offers this gift of rest, and what Christ offers is genuine, and Spurgeon says, if it's his hand that gives it, this ensures you're getting it. And in the passage in Matthew, what Jesus is actually also, right before the passage about come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, right before that, he's actually rebuking a lot of the people who disbelieved, and he's rebuking those who rejected him. And I think sometimes Jesus offers this and we don't believe him and we say no, and this passage in Matthew 11 goes back to Jeremiah 6 and the prophet is speaking against the people of Israel and God is offering, this way of rest. And the passage in Jeremiah 6 says, and they would not walk in it, and that's how the people replied. They would not walk in this way of rest. And I think, the reality is that if we believe Jesus is who he says, when he says something, when he promises something, he's going to make good on that promise. And I think that's something that we can't always rationally understand, because it doesn't make sense. It's a peace that passes understanding, that God can give. But I think when we learn to rest and rely on God, even in hard circumstances, we will see that he has never left us or forsaken us, and he will bring us through those seasons. And even in our doubt, even in our struggle, I think just continuing to come to Christ in the midst of that is so, so important, and learning to do things like lament, and grieve and wrestle with God. God can take our wrestling. He can take our questions and our tears, and bringing, instead of saying, okay, that's not possible and walking away from God, coming to God with that and saying, God, I don't understand how this is possible. Show me, I think is really important.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you said wrestle with God, because even before you said that, I was thinking to myself, you need to wrestle with God sometimes, because I'm going through a really hard time, have been for the last couple of months. We're recording this mid-May, but because of this move and leaving the place we've been for 30 years, it's just been super stressful and worrisome. And I haven't been feeling as close to God as I normally do. And I usually do feel close to him, but I haven't been for a couple of months. And finally, the other day, I said, you know what? I need to search for God with all my heart and really, really go to him and spend that time with him, because I think so often we worry and we do nothing, or we go to the internet and get distracted, or we try and squash it and not think of it. And those things aren't going to bring rest, right? Or we escape and watch, Netflix or read books. We've got to go to God and go through the struggles with him to get to that rest spot, don't you think? Or does it just come naturally to some people, not to others?
It definitely doesn't come naturally to me. So I don't know about any, but, I do think, some people tend to, I think some people are prayer is not something that I'm great at, to be honest. And other people are, that they're more, maybe naturally prone to pray more quickly than I am. For me, I try to do things on my own for a little while first. And then when I'm really out of luck, then I sometimes go to prayer. But, so I think people can maybe struggle in different ways in those areas, but I do think we all need to continue to wrestle with God. And at different points in our lives, it can feel like maybe we're in a season of rest, and we can feel that peace. And then there's other seasons where God seems silent. I've walked through some of those seasons, and we'll probably walk through them again, where I remember telling my husband, a couple of years ago, I almost yelling, not yelling at him, but like yelling in front of him, I'm doing the right things. I'm reading my Bible, I am praying, and I don't feel close to God. And I feel like God's not bringing me out of this kind of pit. And where is God? And just really wrestling with, what do we do when God feels silent, but then at the same time, resting and knowing that, he walks with us through the valley of the shadow of death. And we don't always feel that, in our bodies and our emotions, but trusting even when we can't understand it, that he does. I come often back to the book of Habakkuk, and Habakkuk the prophet is wrestling with God and wondering why he's not judging the wicked. And then when God says he will judge the wicked, God's doing it in a way that Habakkuk's like, wait, I didn't mean like that, so he's going back and forth, and God answers his complaints, but he doesn't actually give him a real answer. It's this back and forth between the prophet and God. And finally Habakkuk says, okay, I will be silent. He says at the end of, I think it's chapter 2. And then eventually, Habakkuk goes into this beautiful prayer where he talks about, though the fig tree should not blossom or fruit be on the vines, I will yet praise you. And I think sometimes, we can want to jump to that last piece of it where we're praising God, but we got to do some of the wrestling first, even when we don't understand what God's doing, or even when he feels silent.
Yeah, I love what you said about that. And that reminds me of another thing that you talked about in your book. You talked about when your mom had cancer and she was putting Bible verses up all over the house. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I don't know if that's a way we can, do all the things that you mentioned doing, the wrestling and all that.
Yeah. So my mom used to write scripture verses on index cards, and she would work on memorizing them. And she would work on, so there was like there'd be a stack of cards in the bathroom. She'd have some in the bathroom mirror. There'd be a stack of cards in the cup holder in the car. There'd be a stack in her purse. I mean, they were like all over. And when she passed away, we divvied up those cards. And I mean, there had to be hundreds of them. There was a lot, because there's 6 kids in my family. We all got some, grandkids got some. I mean, there was a lot. But I think that's just a very practical, tangible way of reminding ourselves of truth and reminding ourselves of who God is and who he's created us to be. And actually, the reason I know about going back to Corrie ten Boom's story is because my mom had written a version of that quote on one of those cards, and then I kind of dug back into Corrie ten Boom's story and into her words. And that was because my mom wrote that on one of those cards and that I read 5 years ago, and that was years after my mom passed away. And so just how the Lord not only used that in my mom's life, but in my own life, and in the writing of this book is just really, really incredible to me. But yeah, really steeping ourselves in scripture and in prayer, however we can, I think is really, really valuable.
Yeah, that's helpful too for when you wake up in the middle of the night with worries and you're, you can't make yourself get out of the bed, then you can meditate in a Bible verse. I do that sometimes, but unfortunately, I hardly have any Bible verses memorized. So I really need to go to the work to memorize ones that kind of talk to the worries that I tend to wake up in the middle of the night, at least now with all this moving stuff. Anyway, what would you say to the person who's listening, who's going through a hard time right now, and she doesn't feel at rest. She feels super in turmoil. And I'm guessing that was a little bit like you back when you were struggling with your depression. What would you say to that person who's listening right now?
Yeah, I'd say a couple things. First is God sees you, and again, even I know sometimes God feels silent, but he sees you. He knows your grief. He knows what you are going through and what you've been through and what you will go through. He knows all of that, and he sees you and he loves you and he sits with you in that darkness. And then secondly, I would say, it's good and right and okay to get the help that you need. I know for me, and everybody's circumstances are different, but for me, part of that help involved counseling and then eventually medication for depression. And being able to let go of just my own pride and insecurity and ask for help where I needed it and have community in my local church where people knew what I was struggling through and could pray with me and could encourage me in the midst of that dark season. We were not meant to do the Christian life or life alone at all. And so, we get to ask for help. People can't always provide the help that we're looking for because we're all limited, right? We're all finite. But I think we can ask and know that God will eventually provide what we need in the times that we need it.
Good. That's great. Well, it's been great talking to you, Sarah, and I love your book, All Who Are Weary, Finding True Rest by Letting Go of the Burdens You Were Never Meant to Carry. Where can people find you online?
Yeah, so you can find me on my website, sarahjhauser.com. And I also send out a monthly newsletter. So you can find that on my website as well. It's just sarahjhauser.com/subscribe. So you can sign up for that. And then I'm also on Instagram, and it's at sarah.j.hauser.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's fun to chat.
Yeah. And thank you, everybody, for listening in. And I hope you have a good week. I will talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Christian Habits Podcast. If you'd like more help with stopping and starting habits, check out Barb's blog at www.barbraveling.com.